I'm joined here today by Michael Shortt, a lawyer, trademark agent, and partner at Fasken's Montreal office, who specializes in video games and life sciences. Of course, today we're here to talk about video games and Michael's work with it. So, hi, Michael, and thank you so much for joining me. How's everything going?
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you for joining. Would you mind giving us a quick introduction to yourself and your background in the games industry?
Sure. So, like you said, I'm a lawyer at Fasken Martineau's Montreal office, and we're a Canadian law firm with offices nationally and then also a couple dotted around the globe. And I'm the co chair of our video game group, which services a huge range of video game clients, ranging from indie developers up to global publishers. And I got my start in the video game industry working mainly for developers, especially smaller indie developers here in Montreal, because there's a flourishing video game ecosystem. And we've proudly to say that Montreal's given rise to a lot of really great indie hits, some of which I've had the pleasure of working on.
Oh, that's amazing. And yeah, absolutely. Montreal's it's an incredible boom and it's still growing. Even bigger studios now opening new studios there as well. That Krafton recently announced they're working on a major
Yeah.
IP there, and yeah, very jealous from Scotland where we have about two. Um, to start us off on a fairly broad question, what are the biggest contract pitfalls that you've found indies run into when looking for publishers?
So the biggest contract pitfalls that I've seen from my indie developer clients, I'd say there's sort of maybe a top three. And one is not knowing what to ask for. So not necessarily having a great sense of what parts of the deal are likely to be flexible and which parts are more or less set in stone. Because there's things that are worth bargaining over and that you in fact can bargain over. There's other things that they're unlikely to ever change it. So you're better off asking for different things, because if even if you are able to get movement on those tough to change set in stone clauses, it's probably going to come at the cost of giving up a whole swath of other things, and you're better off to go after those other things because the deal as a whole will move more in your favor. So the other thing I'd say is not knowing what legalese means. That can be a problem if there's a technical term or a clause whose effect is very technical, and you sign that without a full understanding of what you're doing. Best example there is time is of the essence. That's a sort of a legal term of art that means missing a deadline by even one day, by even an hour is problematic. The classic case I always give is a UK House of Lords case. This poor guy got stuck in traffic and was late to a real estate closing, and he was only 4 minutes late. It was in Hong Kong. I'm sure the traffic was terrible. But as a result of being 4 minutes late, the time is of the essence clause kicked in, and the other side could back out of the deal. And you know from working on any kind of large IT project, delays are pretty common. And so the last thing you want is to sign a time is of the essence clause without knowing what you've given up, which is being one day late, you've just handed the publisher a way to walk away from the deal. And vice versa. In theory, that clause cuts both ways. If they're one day late paying you, you could back out of the deal and cancel their license. So those kind of clauses, if they're in your deal, both sides should know what they do. It's not just sort of legal gibberish that has no real effect. It has a profound effect on the deal and what the rest of the deal terms means. So understanding the legalese is important, and knowing what is legalese in the first place, because sometimes there's coded phrases that you may not realize have a particular meaning from a legal perspective. And so it's a question of like basically the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, being aware of when you've got a phrase that has a special meaning. And then finally, not thinking about both the worst case scenario, which is the one lawyers love to think about, but then also the best case scenarios. Like if the game is wildly successful, if your mobile game becomes the next Angry Birds, there's things you'll want in the contract, and we can eventually talk about them, like tiering the revenue share in a way that if you ever are wildly successful, it moves progressively in the developer's favor. If your game is a moderate hit, those tiers may never matter, but you want to have at least thought about the possibility of wild success and what you would look for in a contract if that did happen. And so I'd say those are sort of the top three things. Like they're pretty broad buckets, but knowing what to ask for, not knowing what the legalese is, and not thinking about both best and worst case scenarios, and sort of focusing only, you need to focus on the most likely scenario, but don't forget on that bell curve, you could be at one end or the other of the two extremes.
Fascinating, yeah, and you can see how these things, like even you're saying, "time is of the essence" clause, and you could read that as just words as written and not understand the ramifications of that so easily. And yeah, I mean, future proofing, right, is such a core thing of computing and technology generally, but it often does get forgotten. I think, especially when everything is so futuristic compared to when these rules were kind of written. So it's totally understandable that people wouldn't think, and it's easy to downplay how good your game is, right? As much as it's easy to overplay how good it is, as you say.
Especially if it's your first game. I mean, most people may feel that they're lucky to even be sort of getting attention from a publisher at all, and may, as a result, discount the chance of wild success. And you know, not every game is going to be a breakout hit, but it's worth thinking about if that does happen. Does your contract reflect that possibility? Because what's fair for a moderate success may not be the same formula that's fair for a breakout hit. And if that happens to be your first game, if you crack the top 10 charts on an app store or on Steam, you want to make sure your contract is calibrated in such a way that you'll get the recognition and the credit you deserve.
And I guess on that, I mean, I think a lot of what you said there about legalese and stuff will tie into this question as well. But what are the most common questions or the first things that you find indies are asking you regarding their contracts?
Sure. So I'd say there's sort of two buckets of questions that I get pretty commonly. One is the question about how royalties and revenue sharing should be set up. Like what's typical in the industry in this deal? Am I getting market? Am I getting better than market? What is the exact, both sort of what are the numbers? Like is 50-50 fair? Should it be something else? And just the mechanics. Depending on sort of the level of business sophistication for a given indie, they may have questions about how frequently they get paid, quarterly versus monthly. They may have questions about currency conversion. They may say, hey, what does this word withholding taxes mean? So there's a whole bucket around how to set up the money side of the deal. And that can mostly that's around the rev sharing, but it can also be about the initial milestone payments because most of these contracts are set up in that the indie developer has to provide milestones, deliver milestones. As they get approved, they get cash in order to finance development of the game. Once the game launches, revenues start coming in from the game, and those revenues get split between the publisher and developer according to different formulas. So there's that upfront question of how am I getting the money to make the game? And then once the game is launched, the question of, okay, how is the revenue generated by the game going to be split between the two of us? So that's bucket number one. And bucket number two is everything around protecting IP, understanding what parts of the game are protectable, what steps you should be taking to protect it, quite apart from the contract, and then also what within the contract itself, what rights are being given from the developer to the publisher, and whether that's fair. Should that be tweaked? And one piece of advice I always give, and this ties those two buckets together, is that three things should always line up. Okay, who has IP rights? Who's going to be using those IP rights? And then third, who's getting money? In the sense that you shouldn't give broader IP rights than the money that's going to come back to the developer. It doesn't make sense to give, say, merchandising rights to the publisher if there's no royalties for merchandising sales. And occasionally I've seen that in a contract, and it's not always clear if that was just a slip. Someone forgot to include the royalty clause, even though they copied over the merchandising rights. Or was it, they're trying to get something for nothing? And that's just not fair. Like in general, if someone's giving you IP, you should have the obligation to use it and the obligation to pay for the money, to pay a share of the money you made from using that IP. So if those three things are ever out of alignment, the contract probably needs some adjustment to be commercially reasonable to both parties.
Fascinating. And yeah, I really loved when you were talking about the difference between indie contracts and sort of typical game contracts and traditionally with regards to IP rights and how big a difference there really is, at least in that initial approach, but how easy it is to not understand because then the legalese of that is really fascinating as well. And yeah, it's a very important distinction, definitely. And even with that, I guess, as we're seeing kind of indies working with larger publishers as well as more indie focused ones at this point, have you seen changes over the past few years in how publishers are approaching indies and then the game specifically?
Sure. So I'd say there have been a couple of changes, some of which are sort of more favorable to developers, some of which are more favorable to publishers. One of the developer friendly changes that I've been seeing is a greater and greater tendency to give some revenue sharing before the publisher has fully recouped its own investment. If you go back maybe 10 years, the typical deal says, I'm going to finance the game, and then once the game's on the market, I get all the money until I've recovered the amount that I invested in the game, either to make the game or to market the game. But more and more, we're seeing some amount of revenue sharing before that recoupment milestone is reached from the publisher's side. I'd say it can be anywhere between 5, 10, 15, 20%. 5 is probably too low to make a difference, but say 10 to 20. Rarely will you see more than that. But that's something that didn't really exist a decade ago. And that's generally, obviously that's good for developers. It means they'll start seeing revenue earlier. It means that the publisher is taking a bigger risk that the game may not break even by sharing revenue even before the game has broken even. And it reduces the chance that all the games will break even. Because if you're giving 20% of your revenue away, you need to make that much more for the publisher to make their money back. The other things I've seen are sort of, I'd say, more pro-publisher, or you could see it as less friendly to developer. One of those is that And we can get into maybe the mechanics of IP in a minute, but publishers, the big difference between a traditional publishing contract and indie publishing contracts, the publisher says in an indie contract, you keep ownership of the IP, you're just licensing it to me. And those licenses are often more extensive than people may realize. But quite apart from that, one thing we're seeing is that a lot of publishers are now layering on top of their license obligations in the contract over sequels, expansions, basically attempts to give them a cut of any sequel that's made with other publishers, or to oblige the developer to come back to that first publisher to work on the sequel. And there's, you can see that as being sort of fair or unfair depending on who you're working for. Publishers would say, well, the only reason you're making a sequel is because your first game was a success. I financed that game, so you should come back to me and give me a first crack at a sequel. Developers would say, well, the game, I'm sure your marketing was great and you did pay for it, but the game was a success because of our work. And if you're a good publisher, we'll want to come back to you anyways because you know us, you know our game, and vice versa. So you don't need a clause like that. Why are you making me come back? Whereas if everything worked out great, I'd come back voluntarily. So sometimes you can have a tug of war on that clause, but that kind of clause is becoming more and more common, where the publisher says, I want rights over your future games, even if I don't own the IP in this game or the future games, but I want you to come back to me. So trying to tie the developer to the publisher in the long run. And that can be, depending on the kind of game you're launching. If you see it as a game that could become a franchise, you're basically being asked to make a very large commitment to the developer when you sign that first contract, because the publisher wants you to, almost like record deals used to be for bands, where you'd be locked in for multiple albums. We'll see if your first album is a hit, and if it is, well, you signed. The problem is you're signing as a developer when you have the least negotiating power. Typically, your first game is the one where success is most uncertain. You don't have a track record yet. The publisher therefore tends to be able to get the best deal, and they're going to try and, in some cases, say not only do you have to come back to me for the sequel, but if we can't agree on the exact terms for the sequel, we'll use the terms of this first deal. And that's a raw deal for the developer typically, because the developer had the least negotiating power for their first game. All of the terms on second and subsequent games should be getting better for the developer, because the developer has a better track record. You have a built-in fan base. There's less risk for the publisher, because the publisher knows if I'm selling the sequel, well, people bought the first one. Those same people should like and buy the sequel. So you should see, because it's less risky, for example, you should get better rev share for the developer. And then the issue becomes, if we're locked in on the terms of that first deal, even though the second deal should be better, well, if we can't agree how much better, we default back to that first deal, which was less favorable to the developer. So we're seeing a lot of clauses around controlling sequels, controlling future production in the franchise itself. And I'd say the last thing is that termination clauses, so the clauses that deal with how can one party or the other get out of the contract, those are becoming a lot more complex, a lot more sophisticated, and in some cases a lot more sneaky. But that's something that I've seen in different forms, is the termination clauses. People are thinking about them a lot more, and they're building more contingencies in there. And if you're the developer, typically the publisher's draft that comes over, you'll want to pay a lot of attention to the termination clause. So it seems paradoxical thinking about how to get out of the deal before you're even into it. But you want to just make sure that the ways to get out of the deal are fair to you. And the easier it is to get out, the less it's important to you what the deal looks like. If it's really hard to get out of a deal, you better be really sure you like that deal. So the more restrictions are placed on the developer's ability to get out, and usually there are a lot for good reasons, but there's a lot of them. So you want to be really sure the deal is good. Whereas if the publisher has lots of outs, it may be easier for you to sell them as a developer on making certain changes in your favor by saying, look, if those don't pan out the way you expected, you can always get out of this deal. You can walk away. So that's something you can play around with as a bargaining chip for both sides.
Fascinating. And wow, yeah, there's so many the having the repeat use of a publisher, it does really muddy the waters of how much you own and how much control you have over your own IP, that you're not losing the IP, but you're effectively
Yeah.
locked in.
It's like giving like a right of first refusal over your house. Like, yeah, you continue to own your house, but if you've got to go back to a specific person before you can put that house on the market, your ownership is now it's to a certain extent it's becoming theoretical. Even if yes, legally you do own the house, economically there's a drag on your ability to do something with your house.
Yeah, well, so the next I was going to ask about if you think that the dynamics improving, but it sounds like it's maybe hard to say if improving is necessarily the right word for it. It's certainly becoming more complex, and it's interesting that you mentioned how it's more like the music industry, or that used to be this thing in the music industry, because I think a lot of things in games people still forget it's so young. that it does have these things that you see that happened a long time ago in music and film encroaching now into games, and maybe that's just the way uh, a business develops to some extent. But it can whether or not it's an improvement, I guess, is quite hard to define.
Well, I think that's a really good point. That even when we look at some of the titles that game studios, the word studio that was borrowed from movies, director and producer roles, they don't mean the same thing as movies. But we took those titles from the movie industry, and we've moved further and further away from the content behind the label, but the label came from the film industry. And some of the early publishing deals even included what were called morality clauses, which were clauses designed to say like don't get drunk, don't get into fights, don't get arrested, all of these things that made sense in a contract with a high profile movie star, but that like make absolutely no sense in the gaming industry. So been a lot of sort of drawing on examples from film, and sometimes there's good lessons to be learned. Other times it's just sort of recycling clauses from a different industry, completely different economic context, and they just don't make sense here. For example, I try to take out those morality clauses just because they don't really have a legitimate purpose. So if they're gonna be used, it's probably not for the right reasons. The other thing is, if you ever try to, great negotiating tip is if you see a clause you don't like, try to mirror it and say, look, well, if you can terminate our side of the contract if we misbehave, well, I want to be able to do that if there's like, a sexual harassment scandal at your company. And then companies sort of realize like, oh, maybe this could have unintended consequences if a high level manager misbehaves. So like, okay, fine, we'll just take it out. So one way to deal with problematic clauses is to say like, look, if it's fair for me, it's fair for you. So let's make it mutual. Or if you don't think it's fair for you, then let's just take it out. And that doesn't work every time, but that's a really good negotiating tip for people to keep in mind.
Oh, oh, no doubt. That's really interesting, especially with them, in the last few years, the things that we've seen happen in games, even just in terms of employee treatment and things like this. You could imagine that being, yeah, a hard thing to reflect back at some of these major companies. That's really fascinating. And with major companies, actually, have you seen a shift of, it's tough to say larger developers, sorry, larger publishers, but certainly kind of the more ubiquitous publishers, the publishers that everyone thinks of. Have you seen them working more with indies? And if they do they have a different approach, or are indies still very much working with indie specific?
I think there's still fairly distinct ecosystems. The really large companies that sort of do everything in house from development to publishing, think about Ubisoft, or studios that own publishers that own a whole bunch of different stable development studios, like say EA. They don't necessarily have the economic. They don't see the interest in the scale of returns to a typical indie publishing contract. Because if they're chasing billions, trying to get them interested in a game that could make a couple million if it's successful, or even if you're on a micro scale, a couple 100,000, for them it's just not interesting. Sort of the amount of money they need to make for it to be considered material, given the scale they operate at, just doesn't square well with indie studios or the kinds of markets that they sell into. Now, that's not to say that they don't pay attention to indies. A lot of the trends we see in AAA gaming are often things that are borrowed from the indies or from smaller studios of different kinds. But I'd say there's multiple aspects to the typical indie publishing model that just don't appeal to the larger publishers. I think AAA publishers, they've got their own incentives, their own stakeholders they're beholden to, and those people, for a number of reasons, wouldn't be all that impressed with the returns available to an indie game, even a quite a successful one.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Well, it's a little like Warren Buffett was saying. He was like, I need to find an investment opportunity for multiple billions of dollars. There just aren't very many of those. And you may have a great way that I can turn like a million into 2 million, but he's like, I would need 1,000 of those opportunities to turn my billion into 2 billion. So it's just not interesting to me to have that one opportunity. I'm just, the numbers in my bank account are so large, it restricts the kind of opportunities I can really be interested in because I can't spread my attention over 1,000. I need a smaller number. And that's, I think, the trap that you fall into when you're too big is just you still have limited attention spans, limited management bandwidth. And then that focuses your attention on a certain kind of opportunity, which may not, which is unfortunate for everybody. I think a lot of them might be interested in getting into this, but just the practicalities mean it's really impossible for them to take their existing publishing budget and split it 1,000 ways instead of like five.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah, no doubt, because then also, yeah, the amount of management that then goes into that of doing everything is it's going to leach that money anyway, so you wouldn't even get the same return.
That's what you see sometimes, some places or companies will open up basically an indie publishing arm, or there's some funds that are essentially more like investment funds. They end up being a publisher in the financing role rather than the finance and marketing role. But they, again, that's an attempt to sort of take management and focus management on one thing, or not one thing, but on several indie publishers, but to
Hmm.
say, this is all we're going to do. We're not going to try and play in both markets at once. We're going to back projects that we believe in the indie market. And then that way you have people who are focused on that, who can build the necessary expertise and relationships, and just not be sort of distracted by chasing billions at the same time you're trying to chase multiple millions.
And yeah, it's nice to see that actually, like more and more. I feel like you see these indie publishing arms, and it's kind of surprising some of the companies that come out and do it. But it feels like it can only really be a good thing. And maybe it's this other way in that we start rebuilding the mid tier that does still exist somewhere. But yeah.
And that's I think a really good comment, in that the mid tier, unfortunately, the industry's shape is really like an hourglass right now, where you have
Mm,
massive behemoths at the top, you have a sea of very small indie studios of say 1 to 10 employees, and then there's a gap in the middle where you used to have those say 50 to 150 person studios, and a lot of the games that are regarded as classics now were produced by those studios in the late 90s to early 2000s. And then just because of a variety of factors, that the industry hollowed out, but in the middle rather than overall. And I'd love to see an industry that goes from an hourglass to a cylinder, or even a pyramid, just
totally.
to have more in the middle, one way or another.
You hit the nail on the head with saying that they were the ones making so many of those revolutionary games, because almost people talk about how indies are doing it now, and indies are the ones making all these incredible games that just you play and you can't believe that someone thought of this. And it's like, but it's not just the indies only do that. The major companies have it, but there's so many people on those teams that you end up generalizing almost the intent by the end of it. And it's that mid tier where you can have a bit of both. You can have that almost auteur kind of view that you used to get in the games industry of these very specific people like Sid Meier and
Yeah,
Peter Molyneux and stuff.
yeah, and I think it's telling that often when people, if you ask them to sort of name a video game auteur right now, they're like, oh, Kojima, and then it's really hard to add to that list. Like, you really have to. I'm not
So
saying they don't
true.
exist, but in terms of like the really high profile ones, you often have to go back a number of years before you can start adding lots and lots of names to that. Like
Mm.
Carmack, Sid Meier, and all those people tend to be the late '90s ish, and I think that's telling and a little bit unfortunate that that's where we are now.
Definitely. Yeah, a great example as well being Nick, I think Ken Levine, who, was made BioShock and did all these incredible things, but then you could see got forced to make more BioShock and he didn't want to call it BioShock, call it something else, but because of the way a major company that works, it's going to be we can't drop that name now. It did so well.
Yeah, Kojima famously tried to make Metal Gear Solid 2 as a way to teach his team indirectly, now go off and do your own thing. Didn't want to make Metal Gear Solid 3. Wanted Metal Gear Solid 4 to end the franchise. Like, you're right. These auteurs often want to explore many ideas, but become the prisoners of their own success. And, it's the same thing with Hollywood. We often see movie franchises being shaken down for sequels long after the creative spark has sputtered out. You may think that, I'm not going to name names because I don't want to offend anybody, but you may often think that, first movie's great, second movie, okay, and then third to, 20 or however many numbers that is, they just weren't as great as they used to be. And I can, a lot of 80s action franchises were great in the 80s, and then attempts to either prolong them into the 90s or revive them today have been quite disappointing for everyone concerned. And video games, it can often be the same problem. And that it goes back to the fact that often the investments are quite large. So it's a lot easier to sell someone on making a sequel to a game that succeeded a couple of years back than to try to roll the dice on something completely new. And I remember George Lucas, of all people, had a really insightful comment where he said, look, the music industry is a lot like gambling. You've got this talented young card sharp. You send them to the casino with money and say, please come back with more than we sent you with. But you have to accept, as the person financing the movie, you're going to lose some, you're going to win some. And you trying to tell the gambler, well, we've done some market studies and we think red is really hot right now. Why don't you put the chips on red? That's not going to help your professional gambler make more money. You're just going to interfere with your own success. And another good example, Games Workshop, way back in the day, had this very rigid distinction between the creatives and the marketing team. The marketing team were told, you have no input over the creatives. They're going to come up with ideas. You sell them. You do not get to tell them what's hot in the market, what you think will sell. And I think the success of their lore, and the reason it feels so authentic to so many people, was that it was not driven by marketing. It was driven by the sort of the very authentic creative voice. And after that, marketing got involved. And I think one of the difficulties a lot of creatives face now is the attempt to manage risk by managing the creative process. And I'm not sure that ever really pays off. I think maybe a little bit on the margins it can be helpful, but I think far too often we try to tinker directly with the creatives by people who are not by nature creative. I would never try to tell my clients how to make a better video game. That is absolutely not my job. And so I think it's unfortunate when other people in the ecosystem try to do that. And I think that really can stifle innovation. But again, the amount of money involved means you need some level of risk management. And so part of the indie publisher and indie developer dynamic is who has creative control, how much input you have, how do you work collaboratively together? Because the publisher may have good insights, and those may even be sort of marketing style insights about this kind of mechanic sells very well in this market, but not in this one. So maybe we should adjust. At the same time, you don't want to interfere with the core creative vision of the developer because that's why you're hiring them in the first place. And so it's often about striking that balance about how can we give feedback and make sure it's considered respectfully without either party trying to impose their will on the other.
So interesting. And do you think that that trust is increasing because of indies just being more established, or is it harder now because everyone knows indies are doing well, so there's kind of more attention on that scene as well?
I think it tends to be more case by case in the sense that as a studio develops a track record, either for the same kind of game, the same genre, or overall. I'm thinking of Thunder Lotus, which is a studio here in Montreal that did Jotun, Sundered, and Spiritfarer, and those are vastly different games. And that's a good example of a studio that's proven they can make great games in many genres. And there's other studios that say focus over and over on just making shooters or infinite runners, or maybe it's even a particular platform they specialize in. But trust is easy once you've shown you can do something and you've done it before, and you're coming back to say, hey, we're going to repeat the magic. All we need is some money to get us started, or all we need is help with the marketing. And that's where I think it's easier to have trust. The most difficult part is always when you show up and you say, I've never done this before, but give me a bunch of money. Or I've never done this before, but help me sell the game that I'm going to make in the next 6 to 9 months, or even, worse, in the next 2 to 3 years. So trust tends to be very individualized. It's specific to studios. It can be specific to people. People may go off and found their own studio, but because of the games they've been involved in the past, they may have a track record that they can rely on when they deal with publishers. And it can be the other way around. Publishers may be able to say, hey, go talk to some of our existing developers, and they'll tell you what it's like to work with us. And that's our track record of satisfied developers. And where trust comes from a track record, and you can have a track record on either side. And the other thing it tends to come from is individuals. And so one of the tricky bits is often if you have two people who trust each other quite a lot, but they're both parts of companies, especially the publisher, which tends to be bigger and therefore tends to have more turnover. One of the reasons you want to have a contract and to work on it quite carefully is because individuals may leave, but the contract's going to stay. So you need the trust, but then you also need a framework that if the people change, you still have rules that everyone can abide by if you need them. And that's sort of the paradox of a lot of these negotiations is we're focused on the contract, which you're only going to need if trust breaks down or if something unexpected happens. So ideally, we work on this thing you'll never need. In that case, it's a little bit like insurance. You hope you never need it, but you want to be able to trust the company that they'll be there for you if you do need to call on them.
Oh, fascinating. And you mentioned about when Raw Fury publishing their contract. Did that, because I saw there was a few other smaller publishers actually, even I think than Raw Fury, who then followed it and kind of did a similar thing and decided to publish theirs too. Did that, or did you, from your perspective, do you think that changed any wider movements in the indie publishing scene, or do you think it was very unique to kind of the ones that published, as you say, have updated it since then, but did other publishers kind of stick with what they had, or?
So I think that was really a moment in time where Raw Fury made a decision to put theirs out there in the interest of transparency. And that was a really admirable move on their part. And they got so much attention, both, I think, fair criticism and unfair criticism, that scared a lot of other people from publishing theirs. Whitethorn Games put theirs out there. But to my knowledge, that was the only other sort of very widely available one at that point. I know that I've talked to other publishers at events, and they've said, we looked at what happened to Raw Fury, and most people spent their time focusing on criticism, which is kind of natural. Anyone who's writing about those things is going to talk mostly about the things they change or to give warnings. And Raw Fury's model is quite unique in some ways, so it wasn't a typical indie deal in many ways. It was typical in some, but not in other core aspects. So in a way, it sort of, they put out a very different business model than your typical publisher. So I think a lot of publishers felt like, okay, they're doing their own thing. I don't really offer the same thing. Our deals aren't necessarily comparable. It's an apples to oranges situation. So I don't really feel like I need to put mine out there. And also looking at how much flack they got, I just don't know if I need to share it. Like if you're already well established, you putting your contract out there won't necessarily raise your profile. And you may prefer, if you're going to make changes anyways, to keep it close to your chest. Or if you think that a particular developer is going to want changes, it may or may not be the right thing to do to put it out. You may not want to create expectations on either side. So I think we're not going to see much. Certainly, there haven't been very many since that initial that moment in time, which is too bad, because one of the interesting things from both a developer and a publisher perspective is publishers have worked with many different developers, but always with their own contracts. So they don't necessarily have a great sense of what is market. And developers typically don't, for a given game, have that many publishers at a time. They're not going to have 10 or 12. You know, a lucky developer will have 2 or 3 seriously invested and interested publishers. Often it may only be one. And that means that neither side has really seen what's market. And that's where what's interesting for me as someone who works for a whole variety of developers is I've seen many, many different publishers' contracts, because they're all dealing with different publishers. It's not like they're all dealing with the same one. And so that gives you a sense of what is market, because each publisher has their own sort of template contract, like we saw with Raw Fury and Whitethorn. And those two contracts are completely different on so many different levels. And that's why trying to judge market is difficult for developers to do, but also for publishers, because they only have they don't see other publishers' contracts. So it's an interesting industry where both of them are double blind, in the sense that developers don't necessarily know what deals they can get from a bunch of other publishers, unless, as I say, they're lucky and they're being courted by multiple publishers at once. The publishers themselves only know the terms they've offered to other developers, and they only know their own terms. They don't necessarily have a great insight into what their competitors are offering. And that's pretty unique from a lot of industries' perspectives.
Yeah, another games industry thing that's sort of asynchronous with everything else. And yeah, no, it makes total sense. I imagine that there's some people that probably look at, if more contracts came public, they would go, "Whoa, we're really overpaying these guys. Like we're going so much harder in initially than a lot of publishers are." Maybe it's like others want to negotiate more while they're just kind of happy to put it out there. But wow, that's really interesting. Yeah.
That's a really good point. That Americans, it's a bit of a stereotype, but they tend to be much more aggressive on some negotiating points. Their American publisher side lawyers are aggressively thinking about the worst case scenario, and so that's something that they are very, very conscious of, and they spend a lot of time negotiating, litigating, fighting over. I had one negotiation that took almost a year with an American publisher. It was a special case for a variety of reasons, but I mean, I'd say if it's Americans, it's going to be longer. If it's Europeans, it's typically shorter. These are vague, very wide generalizations, but a lot of it does depend on the approach of individual publishers. And some terms are very deal specific. Money is a great example, how much a game costs and how you're going to split the revenue. Other things tend to be what people think of as boilerplate. The publisher is going to try and impose something similar on all of its development studios. So that's another issue where publishers typically expect to negotiate some things, but not others. And developers may have the same or different expectations about what parts are going to be negotiated. And so that's where it's helpful, ideally, to have negotiated with a particular publisher before, because you'll have a sense of where they're flexible and where they're not, but also have a sense of, in the industry in general, how these things typically get handled, and what parts you typically have flexibility on.
Super interesting. And actually, and with flexibility in your talk, you talked a lot. It's a really good talk, and anyone who's listening to this who hasn't seen it should absolutely go listen, because it is absolutely fascinating. And a great class of also really good questions as well from the audience as well.
Mm-hmm.
But you talk about moving milestones and how milestones are a bit more flexible with indies than it is with like a major publisher. I mean, we're talking about money as well. Of course, it's easier to move those things around. Have you seen any? Is that improving? Is it getting stricter, less strict? Obviously, because of the pandemic has affected the whole industry in terms of release schedules. So are indie publishers being stricter with their milestones, or is it still a kind of fairly healthy space?
I'd say it remains reasonably flexible. I think, if anything, the pandemic helped everyone realize the challenges that can come for it, not just the people they're doing business with, but themselves sometimes. Publishers were often affected to a certain extent. Often developers, one of the advantages of video games is so much of the work can be done remotely or from home. So our industry was less affected. Sales platforms were also virtual rather than brick and mortar for them. But the most important sales platforms were all virtual. So we were able to, I think, weather the pandemic better than many other industries. But it did, I think, provide a lesson for a lot of people about the need for flexibility. And, in my career, I haven't had a client come back and say, "Hey, we're having trouble with the milestones and flexibility there." I'm not saying it'll never happen, but
Mm,
milestones are typically something you see get worked out on the ground, as long as it's not a big deal. You know, if someone's sick, there's a vacation, you want some flexibility. There's just unexpected problems that'll take a little bit longer to resolve. Most publishers, as long as the ultimate end release date doesn't shift too much, are usually pretty reasonable about what happens in between. Um, and that's I think to the credit of the industry. Like no one wants to. Once you're into these agreements, you ideally don't want to have to burn your bridges over something like that, because the difficulty of getting out over has to be worthwhile. There's going to be a big disruption if the publisher pulls the plug, even if it's sort of termination for breach. So, an ideally, a publisher, if they're able to be flexible in milestones and still protect their own commercial interests, they're definitely going to try and do that because they don't want to have to escalate to termination if they don't have to.
That makes total sense. Yeah, even if you get that money back, how long it'll take to get that money back, the disruption
Like
to it.
imagine there's the if game is development is broken down completely, the studio seems like they're on the verge of shutting down or whatever. Obviously the publisher's going to try and step in and take over development, but if it's just a milestone's 3 weeks late, is it worth it to go through the whole complex process of terminating the contract, finding another developer, doing all of that? You know, if it's a matter of days, it's almost a given that nobody is going to make a big deal or a big fuss out of that. If it's a matter of a couple of weeks for one milestone, again, I don't see a big problem. If it's a pattern of repeated delays, then the publishers, if anything, are going to sort of ask, like, why is this happening? Like, did we understaff? Were we too aggressive with the milestones? Can we work something out for future milestones to make sure that everything now syncs up again? And maybe that's the flexibility that comes at a cost, where it's like, okay, we will up your budget so you can hire someone else, but now we're going to ask for something in return. So overall, milestone schedules are the things that get worked out business to business, less at the legal level, unless something goes catastrophically wrong. And in most cases, that's not going to happen. And so that's at least one thing that I can say that's pretty reassuring for developers and also for publishers for that matter.
Totally, yeah. And then I guess it's it, right? A lot of people forget that people want to see good games come out too. So
Yeah.
if they're publishing it, there's something in it they see that they like, and whether that's a personal level that they want to play it or they know it'll do well. You wouldn't want to lose that or lose what it could be.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, if no one really benefits from rushing out a game or not releasing a game at all. I mean, Shigeru Miyamoto had a great quote where he said, like, a late game is eventually a good game, but if you put out a bad game, it's going to be bad forever. And there's some notable bad games that were patched into either acceptability or greatness later, but you know, rushing something out, and there are a lot of horror stories about publishers putting too much pressure to release a game before it's ready. I'm not going to say it never happens, but certainly on the indie stage, one of the advantages of having slightly lower amounts of investment in the game is usually that your game failing to come out has a smaller impact on the publisher's bottom line on their cash flow. So often they can be a little bit more flexible. On the other hand, one of the problems of AAA is you're captive to the large amounts of money that are being worked on. So if someone is budgeting a big game to come out in Q1, they may not have an easy cash flow to give you a 6 month delay or even a 3 month delay. They may really be counting on your release in Q1 leads to all this money, and if that money doesn't come in, we can't make payroll for our staff. Or we have such a huge shortfall in our budget that even if we can make payroll, someone higher up the chain of command is going to be really, really unhappy. So one of the reasons I think you can get flexibility or more flexibility on an indie level is the investment is smaller and the eventual revenue stream is smaller, so it's less high stakes. And even if it's a little bit delayed, it's not like it's bet the company levels of money. Whereas if you've got quite a large game that's coming out a year late, that is asking the publisher for a significantly bigger monetary commitment to sort of support your game, not just because it's going to take more to get it to that stage, but also the delayed income stream for them is going to be a lot more important.
And I think it's interesting as well because I think a lot of people don't realize how much games cost. It's like people often just look at it and they think, oh, but it's just a bunch of people sitting in a room working on computers. Well, how is that so difficult? And they just don't think of all these knock-on effects or even the scale of the teams that work on it. Credits on AAA games have got to a good 20
Yeah.
minutes now if
Yeah,
you watch the
that's
whole
the
thing.
thing. You look at the sheer number of people involved and just do some mental math about, well, if they're paid this much, this many people for 2 years, 3 years at a time, that adds up to a very, very large amount of money.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, let's well, hopefully indie doesn't get to quite that level of intensity or a mid tier even. Um, Thank you so much for joining us for part one of our interview with Michael Shortt, video game and IP law specialist, partner at Fasken's Montreal offices, and all round insightful great guy. I hope you learned as much as I did from part one of the interview, and I can assure you that part two is just as interesting and insightful. So I hope you can join us then. And lastly, Just to mention that all views shared by any of the individuals in the interview are those of the individual and do not represent our respective companies.